Hi everybody, I'm Danielle from Mix Measure Make. You can find my blog at mixmeasuremake.com. Today I'm going to be teaching you how to resize quilt blocks using my Quilt Block Resizing Worksheet. Lots of people are very intimidated by all the math involved in resizing a quilt block and fractions and decimals, but I'm here to tell you that if you follow my step-by-step worksheet and use a calculator, you won't go wrong. You'll be able to make blocks smaller and larger, and there will be no end to your creativity. The pattern that we're going to be resizing together today is my free Rainbow Ring block. You can find it in a link under the video or in one of my blog posts. You'll also be able to find the Quilt Block Resizing Worksheet in a link under the video or in one of my blog posts. Now on the worksheet, there are spots for 12 different cuts to calculate. If you need more room than that, your pattern has more cuts required, you can simply double-side the page when you print it or print more copies as I have done. To resize the quilt block, you'll need the Quilt Block Resizing Worksheet, an original pattern to resize, a pencil, I'm going to use a pen so you can see it better, and a calculator. Feel free to use the calculator on your phone. Before we begin, the most important step is to figure out how much you're going to reduce or enlarge your quilt block by. For example, my original Rainbow Ring block was 7.5 inches wide and 7.25 inches tall. I decided that I wanted to resize it to be half the width and half the height so that I could turn it into coasters. So I divided my pattern by 2 to get that finished result. So it's helpful to think about the intended purpose of your new quilt block to help you figure out how big it needs to be. If I was going to multiply by 2, I could turn this into a pillow or a mini quilt, which I'm going to do later. When you're deciding an amount to reduce or enlarge your quilt block by, I very much recommend using whole numbers such as 2 or 3. It will just be so much easier to work with than if you use numbers like 1.5 times smaller or 1.5 times bigger. So try sticking with numbers like 2 or 3. Now let's get started, shall we? So here we have our Quilt Block Resizing Worksheet. Earlier we were thinking about how we wanted to resize our quilt block, and in my case I wanted to reduce my quilt block in half to turn it into coasters. So that is dividing by 2. There's multiplying by or dividing by. I'm going to write 2 for dividing by 2, and I'm going to circle it so I remember to do that every time. Then we need to refer back to our quilt block that we're going to be resizing. We're going to look at the first cut, A, and I'm going to note it here, and I'm looking at the original length and width. They already happen to be in decimals, so there's no need to convert them. So it's 7.5 and 1.25. Now often people go wrong because they try to do the calculation right away, but we need to remember that there are seam allowances involved. On any particular piece that you're sewing, there's a seam allowance on the left, the right, the top, and the bottom. So on the left and right, 2 1/4 inch seam allowances make a 1/2 inch, so we need to take that away first. 7.5 subtract 1/2 becomes 7.0. 1.25 subtract 1/2 becomes 0.75. Then we can do our multiplying or dividing, in my case, dividing by 2. So 7 divided by 2 becomes 3.5, and then 0.75 divided by 2 becomes 0.375. Then we can't forget to add the seam allowance back on. So we add the 1/2 inch back. 3.5 plus 1/2 becomes 4. 0.375 plus a half becomes 0.875. Now the next step is to convert back to fractions. This one's easy, it's just 4 inches. This one, 0.875, we're going to refer down to the handy conversion chart down here, and we see that 0.875 is exactly 7/8 of an inch. So that's great. Now, there is an asterisk here that when necessary, round up to the nearest 1/8 inch for cutting, then trim down any excess as required after piecing to adjacent cuts. That means that if you have a decimal that does not work out evenly to 1/8, you're going to need to round up to make your cut. If you round it down and cut the fabric by rounding down, it would be too small and it wouldn't match the pieces it was supposed to piece with. So for example, if we had a decimal that was 0.68, therefore in between this one and this one, we would have to round up to 6/8 or 3/4 to make the cut. Then when you line it up with the pieces that it's joining with, if it's a little bit longer, you can trim off so that it's even on the edges. Then we refer back to our original pattern. Cut A needed 2 cuts. And then I can quickly see that I need to make 2 cuts that are 4 inches by 7/8 inches. And when those have been completed and cut, I can check it off. It helps me keep track. Now, if I was going to enlarge a quilt block, let's do one example that way. Let's say I'm going to resize it times 3. 3 times as big. Let's start again with A. Again, 7.5, 1.25. Then again, even though I'm enlarging this time, I still have to subtract my seam allowance. 7.5 take away half is 7. 1.25 take away a half is 0.75. Now I'm going to multiply by 3. 7 times 3 will be 21. And 0.75 times 3, double checking, 2.25. And then adding the 1/2 inch seam allowance back on, 21.5. 2.25 plus a half, 2.75. Now converting back to fractions, so 21.5 inches and 2, and this one works out evenly, 2 3/4 inches. A reminder again that A required 2 cuts. So I can see that for A I would have to make 2 cuts that were 21.5 inches by 2 3/4 inches, and when they were completed I would check them off. I would continue my calculations for all the cuts on the original pattern, and when they were done I would cut them out and re-sew them together following the same instructions, and the result would be a resized quilt block. I guarantee that if you follow this step by step carefully and double check with a calculator, that you will have great results and it will no longer be intimidating to resize a quilt block.